And a warm greetings and salutations to everybody watching this video, which I hope is everyone in my class, because it would be very, very important and it's very beneficial that everybody watches this lecture. Now, first off, you all have my apologies about having to cancel class on Tuesday. However, you would be very pleased to know. Come here, buddy. Come here. Come here, friend. I guess we'll have to wait a moment. I am pleased to announce that the Osiris, this little guy, with his little shaved belly, look at that shaved belly, he's so cute. I am pleased to announce that he is in fairly decent health, and he is expected to survive, which is good. So, go ahead and say hi to the class, Osiris. Oh my god, hi. Oh my dad. Dad. Oh, Dad. Hi, class. Dad loves you. I guess I love you too. Dad. Anyways. This guy's getting pissed off, so we'll put him down. However, we can all have met the Osiris. That's a good boy. Anyways, so, moving on. Time to talk about time inconsistency and monetary policy. Now, we remember, under the problem of time inconsistency, the issue that we ran into was that players in a game may sometimes have an incentive to make a policy announcement in the first period of the game, and then the second period of the game have absolutely no incentive to follow through on that policy announcement. That leads to the issue of time inconsistency. So, two examples I gave, both of which were in class. There was one of if you and your siblings are ever in a fight, and your sibling's like, you know, if you do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to kill you. Well, if you're watching this video, one would assume they didn't kill you. You're still alive. Chances are they didn't follow through on that threat. So sometimes they want to make a threat, and then when it comes time to actually make good on that threat, they've got no incentive to do so whatsoever. Another example would be a significant other going, sure, go out this weekend, that's fine. Go for it. I got no problem with it. Go. And then you go, and then you get in trouble. You wonder why you got in trouble. Well, you got in trouble because of the problem of time inconsistency. And maybe also not paying that close of attention to your significant other. Maybe that's why I'm single. Moving on. There are other issues of time inconsistency as well. There's another example that we could use where, let's say, you're getting mugged on the street by a criminal with a gun. He's got a gun in your face, and he says, if you don't give me your wallet, I'm going to kill you. Well, he might kill you, he might not. We don't know. Right? Criminals are assumed to operate under rationality. However, they don't always operate under rationality. So if he announces, hey, if you don't give me your wallet, I'm going to kill you, well, you're stuck with one of two options. Give him the wallet or don't give him the wallet. Conditional on him either killing you or not killing you. So there's like a decision tree that follows here. So you can either give him the wallet and expect him to not kill you, hopefully he doesn't kill you, or you can go, screw you, I'm not giving you my wallet, in which case this criminal will go, well, okay, I issued an empty threat, because if I kill you, chances are I'm going to get caught and go to jail for the rest of my life, and depending on the state that I'm living in, I might also be executed, which nobody really wants to be executed. You don't really want to go join the void. Well, I guess some people do, but for the most part, you don't want to go join the void. So there are plenty of occasions where someone will have an incentive to make some policy announcement at time t, but at time t+1 or t+n, whenever the point in time comes to make good on that policy announcement, they all of a sudden lose all motivation and all incentive to make good on that threat, hence the problem of time inconsistency. Now, under monetary policy with time inconsistency, it's basically the same idea. We're taking a game theoretical model, only what we're doing is we are applying it to a macroeconomic context of monetary policy. Right, so it's a model by Barrow and Gordon. It's like 1980 something. I believe it's like 1988, 1989, maybe 1987, somewhere in that range, where they look at the problem of time inconsistency and monetary policy, and then discuss how there are different scenarios where there could be rules or discretion that could be allowed, or I guess given, to the Federal Reserve or the central bank in general. There are times where the central bank can be bound by rules and we can have a socially optimal outcome. There are times when the central bank can be basically allowed a little bit more discretion, which could also lead to a socially optimal outcome. It depends on a couple of factors. We'll be discussing all of those today. So, under this model by Barrow and Gordon, and this is what I had set up last week, we had ultimately two big equations that we wanted to use. There was the monetary authority's utility, which is expressed via this. Right here. Right now, recall that y sub t in here is the actual rate of output. We're not looking at levels of output, we're looking at rates of output. So this is a rate of change in output. And this y sub n, is what's known as the natural rate of output. It's the rate of output that would be consistent with the absence of any business cycle shocks. And then what we have here is inflation. Now what we can see is that if output exceeds actual output, the rate of actual output exceeds the rate, or the natural rate of output, then this term will be positive, right? Well, whether that increases or decreases utility is now entirely dependent upon this term lambda. So we need lambda to be positive. And give me just one moment, please. Hey dude, can I call you in like 25 minutes? Cool, man. Alright, later. Bye. My apologies, one of my best friends just called me, and well, I don't have many friends. I have even fewer that call me. Actually, that's a lie. That's a total bullshit lie. I've got tons of friends, as you can tell. Look at all of them. There's one sleeping right here who's super cool. It's the Osiris. Anyways, we require that lambda is greater than 0. And the interpretation of this term lambda is the following. It's how much the central bank cares about deviations of output from its natural rate. Another way to think of it is how much the central bank cares about deviations in output from its natural rate relative to inflation. Because if we notice, lambda is positive, meaning as long as the current rate of output is larger than the natural rate of output, the utility, or the happiness that the central bank receives will increase. They'll be happier with themselves, they'll be content, they'll be proud of themselves, be like, oh my god, look at me, I'm doing a good job. Right? They expect a good pat on the head. And in this case, they would deserve a good pat on the head. It's called that they are, at least to some degree, conducting monetary policy in a way that is favorable to growth in the economy. Right? So that's the Fed side, or the central bank side of this set of equations that we were looking at. The second set we'll put up here, it's the public. Right, now the public faces this equation. All right, so we've got YT, current rate of output, equals the natural rate of output, plus this term here that explains the deviations in actual inflation from expected inflation, multiplied by alpha plus this epsilon t. Right, well, this is current rate of output, we've discussed that. This is the natural rate of output, we've discussed that. This is inflation, we've discussed that ad nauseum at this point. Right, so let's get to this fancy looking E thing of pi t. This is what's known as expected inflation. It's the inflation rate the public expects at any point in time. Now, these expectations are driven by a number of factors. However, what we're going to be considering in this model is that these expectations are going to be driven by Fed policy announcements. Now, as we know, whenever a central bank meets, they have an open market committee. There's some leadership committee that meets, gets together, looks at the state of the economy, discusses the state of the economy, discusses policy implications, policy prescriptions for what to do with the economy, and then afterwards they make some decision on how they're going to manage their monetary policy in a way that ultimately affects inflation. The point is to use some policy tool to affect inflation, because inflation can affect output. The equation that explains that inflation can affect output shows up right here. Because if we were to change inflation, we change output. Right? Well, how much do we affect output? Well, that's what that alpha term is. So alpha, the interpretation of this guy, is how sensitive the public is to deviations of inflation from their expectations of inflation. Right? Because if this alpha is small, then deviations of actual inflation from expected inflation will have very little impact on actual output, or the rate of actual output. But if alpha is large, on the other hand, it's going to have a rather substantial impact. So there's another condition that we have to apply here, right? Because whenever we're using mathematics to explain economics, we have to do so in a way that not only is mathematically consistent, right? We also need something that's economically consistent. So what we need to do is we need to be able to put certain restrictions on various parameters within our models that will allow us to tell a believable story about the economy. So in this case, alpha's got to be greater than 0, meaning any deviation of inflation from expected inflation will have a positive impact on the actual rate of output. And it will do so in a way that is larger than what the natural rate of output is. So that leaves us with this epsilon t thing. I debated whether or not to leave this thing in there or not. I ultimately decided just to keep it in there. And this epsilon t is what's known as a zero mean serially uncorrelated error term, which ultimately accounts for all shocks that are not monetary policy related. Well, what the hell does that mean? Well, what it means is if it's zero mean, right, that means at any point in time, the average of this thing is going to be 0. So the expectation of this guy at any point in time is 0. So what that would translate to in terms of actual economic understanding is that at any point in time, right, we expect there to be no major shocks to the economy because that epsilon t would be 0. It's expected to be 0 every point in time. However, there's a stochastic element to it where sometimes it's not 0. Sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. If it's positive, right, that's going to be something consistent with a positive aggregate supply shock, meaning output were to increase. If it's negative, it means there's a negative supply shock, like, a country got bombed, we hit, this really awful recession, something like that. That would sort of explain what's going on there. So, these are the two equations that we're going to be looking at. And this is what all of it means. So I would say take a moment to look at this, and I can just stand here and play the Jeopardy theme song, but you have this wonderful ability of watching videos where you can push the pause button. So there's really no reason for me to pause. I can just keep going. This is awesome. So what happens? Well, what happens is dependent on a couple of things. First, to save room, because this is a smaller board than what I'm used to being able to write on, at least when it comes to doing lectures. Anybody who wants to buy me a bigger board, that would be nice. Anybody who's watched Dr. Strangelove by this point will know the importance of the big board. You can't let him in here, he'll see the big board. Right? So the central bank has this equation, right? And what that says is they get the happies from having larger increases or larger deviations in output, and they get the sads from having increases in inflation. All right, so this says that there's a trade-off that the central bank faces when it comes to output and inflation. They can't affect output directly, but they can affect inflation directly. They can choose inflation, but they can't affect, or they can't choose this. They can only basically hope to impact it in some way that would be consistent with increasing or maximizing their utility. All right, now there's the public. Which faces this equation. Right now, this is a utility function for the Fed. This is kind of a weird abstract concept here. However, this one is not quite as abstract. It's not as abstract because what it actually is it's describing an aggregate supply curve. Right? This is what's known right here, this entire equation is known as the expectations augmented Phillips curve for output. Right, the original Phillips curve related unemployment with inflation. However, the Phillips curve for output relates output to inflation. And the way this works here is by saying if there are deviations in actual inflation from expected inflation, we will be increasing output. Examples will follow shortly. So, this Phillips curve is also an aggregate supply curve in a sense. Why do we know it's an aggregate supply curve? Well, it relates output and prices where there's a positive relationship between a change in price and a change in output, right? Which is consistent with what the economic theory suggests for an upward sloping supply curve, or in this case, an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. So, what we have is the Fed's utility and an aggregate supply curve. So the idea is the Fed maximizes their utility in a way that hopefully increases output above the natural rate, thereby increasing aggregate supply. But they can't choose YT, they can only choose pi t. And if we look, if they choose pi t, right, the more it increases, the more their utility decreases because it's minus pi t, not plus pi t. So there's a negative relationship between the central bank's utility and the rate of inflation. So if they pick too high of a rate of inflation, it hurts them. They don't want to do that, right? So what's the optimal rate of inflation? Well, I'll say the central bank maximizes their utility subject to the expectations augmented Phillips curve for output. Like this. So they maximize their utility subject to this sucker. And I will skip all of the math because this is a principles of macro course. This is not an intermediate macro course. Therefore, you don't need to know the math. However, what this tells me is that the central bank chooses an optimal inflation rate of pi star. Now it's star here because the star is going to denote optimality. The star here is denoting that what is going on is the Fed has found its optimal inflation rate. Now the optimal inflation rate for the central bank, now granted I'm using central bank, monetary authority, and Fed interchangeably. What's happening is what they're looking at is when they decide to figure out what their optimal inflation rate needs to be, they're looking at a combination of two things. They're looking at a combination of, one, their preferences, right? Their preferences are reflected by this lambda, which shows basically how much they care about changes in output from inflation, or relative to inflation, and how easily they can influence supply. Right? If this alpha is really small, they can't influence it that well. However, if the alpha is rather large, they can influence it quite a bit. And that's going to show up in their choice of an optimal inflation rate. All right, so let me write this out. Lambda is small and the central bank doesn't care too much about increasing output, at least relative to inflation. Now, when that happens, right, what that says is they care more about stabilizing inflation than they do stabilizing output. Right, so they want to stabilize prices more than output. Right? They're more concerned about inflation than they are their ability to affect output. This makes them known as something we call inflation hawks. Now, if lambda is large, what happens is central bank cares more about output than they do stabilizing inflation, which makes them known as inflation doves. An inflation hawk cares more about inflation than output, and inflation dove cares more about output than inflation. So for good examples, or a good example, I guess, the chairwoman of the Federal Reserve Bank, former chairwoman of the Federal Reserve Bank, Janet Yellen, was what's known as an inflation dove. She was really, really, really dovish on inflation because she was more concerned with trying to stabilize output and unemployment than she was inflation. She was also allowed to be in a position at the time of being rather dovish when it comes to inflation because inflation was incredibly low. So they were able to give up some of their concerns for inflation because inflation was much lower than the intended target inflation rate. Therefore, she could be dovish on inflation. Now, there's a president of or former head of the Federal Reserve Bank in Richmond, who, on the other hand, was much more of an inflation hawk. His voting pattern at the Federal Open Market Committee was very consistent with just, look, we need to stabilize inflation, let output do its thing, let the market do its thing, we don't want to mess with it, we don't want to try to influence market conditions that much. He didn't have too much faith in the central bank's ability to be able to influence output through changes in inflation and interest rates. Therefore, he was like, let's just stabilize inflation, keep things nice and just copacetic, keep things chill, let the market do what the market wants to do. So the head of many of these different central banks, or these different regional Federal Reserve banks, vary a lot as far as what their views are. Some of them are much more dovish, some of them are very hawkish. And it's a good thing that we've got a mix of the two, because what we really need when it comes to this stuff is at least some sort of a disagreement as far as policy prescriptions, because that way we can actually get optimal policy. We can make sure that what we're doing is, or that the decisions being made in the central bank are representing the overall economy as best they possibly can. So it's good to have a little bit of disagreement sometimes, right? So they choose an optimal inflation rate of lambda alpha. What that translates out to is the following. We know, just through the way everything works and everything I've given you so far, that lambda is positive, alpha is positive. So both lambda and alpha are strictly positive. And they got to be greater than 0. So if lambda and alpha are both greater than 0, two positive numbers multiplied together give you a positive number. Right? So this implies inflation will be positive. Now, the central bank can come out and announce a zero inflation rate. Which sets expected inflation at 0. So when expected inflation is 0, that means the public expects no inflation. However, this is where things start to change a little bit. There are two different scenarios as far as the expectation assumptions on the public. The first one is adaptive expectations. Now, under adaptive expectations, they formulate their expectations based on what they observe over time. Under adaptive expectations, the public is essentially gullible, at least at the beginning. They get smarter as more things happen, because as more things happen, they can update their information set. Right, so they can, let's write that out. They update their information set, meaning they learn, right? They take in more information, they store more information, they hold on to the information, they assimilate the information, they use it in the future, right? Which means they're no longer that gullible. So that's adaptive expectations. Under adaptive expectations, what happens is, well, let's see. Let's erase some of this stuff. Whatever, because you had that pause button. I'm going to keep these two equations up here and say that the central bank announces well, even better yet, we'll say the central bank lets the public think that inflation will be 0, which implies expected inflation is equal to 0. Right, so the Fed, or the central bank, has every incentive initially to say, okay, cool, we want 0 inflation. Why do they have every incentive to do that? Well, let's see. If expected inflation is 0, but really, what they want for inflation is actually lambda times alpha. And what we get, if we plug lambda alpha in for this pi t and 0 for this e of pi t, what we get is the natural rate of output plus alpha times lambda alpha plus that epsilon t, which means we get this. The actual rate of output, because the public expected 0 inflation, but the Fed tricked them. And the central bank tricked them. Right? Ha-ha, bamboozled again, heckin' bamboozlement. Right? They get bamboozled because they believe inflation will be at a rate of 0. However, inflation is actually a rate of lambda times alpha, which, like I said before, is a multiplicative interaction between how much the Fed cares about output relative to inflation, basically how dovish or hawkish they are, and how sensitive this aggregate supply curve is to changes in inflation from expectations of inflation. Right? Well, because lambda and alpha are positive, lambda times alpha is positive, so if they can set the public's expectations of inflation to 0, they can increase the rate of output in the first period by lambda times alpha squared above the natural rate of output. And then we can also have these shocks that show up sometimes and don't other times, right? Meaning on average, right, because the average of this epsilon t term is 0, what I'll say is the expectation of epsilon t equals 0. On average, this is what we would get in our first period. Right? Lambda alpha squared, well, those are all positive terms. So output, actual output, exceeds the natural rate of output by lambda times alpha squared in the first period, because they tricked them. Right? It's sort of the equivalent of, I'm like, hey, look, your shoes are untied. You look down, and I smack you up across the face. That'll probably work once. Do we think it'll work twice, though? If I go, hey, look, your shoes are untied, you look down, I smack you up across the face, 30 seconds later, I go, hey, look, your shoes are untied, you're going to go, no, they're not. I just checked them. And you smacked me the last time I checked them. I've got like double incentives to not look down right now. Because, one, I know they're not untied, and two, the last time I checked, you hit me. I don't like that. I don't like getting hit. I'd assume you don't like getting hit. Who likes getting hit? Nobody, really. You know, I guess maybe UFC fighters like getting hit once in a while, but even then, I mean, they still tend to get pretty pissed off because you can kind of see it in the ring, you know, when it or the octagon when it happens, right? So they can't be tricked consistently. They get tricked once. And because they got tricked once, they update their inflationary expectations for tomorrow based on what happened today. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 3 times, shame on both of us. Well, this is a fool me once, shame on you. They don't want to be fooled again. So there is no fool me twice. The Fed can try to fool them twice, but the Fed won't fool them twice. Because like I said, it's the equivalent of me going, your shoes aren't tied. Stop being so gullible, McFly. For those of you that have seen Back to the Future. If you haven't seen Back to the Future, watch Back to the Future so you get the joke. So hopefully you can get some of my references at some point throughout the remainder of the course. Right? They're going to set their future inflationary expectations to lambda times alpha. When they do that, ultimately what they do is they punish the Fed. Why are they punishing the Fed here? Well, or not so much why, how. We know why, because they're pissed. Right? But the way they're punishing the Fed is a little different. The way they punish the Fed is because their expectations have now been augmented a little bit. They've adapted to their environment, right? So just like the Borg adapt with their body shielding to the phaser frequencies of Starfleet officers trying to shoot at the Borg, right? They adapt. They adapted to the behavior of the Fed by recognizing what the Fed's actually going to do instead of what the Fed says it's going to do. And in doing so, they update their inflationary expectations from 0 to lambda times alpha. What does this mean for the Fed? Well, what it means for the Fed, or the central bank, is that, well, they're screwed. Why? Well, we'll see in a second. Once I erase all this crap. Now, I'll say tomorrow, but what I really mean by tomorrow is more next period. So tomorrow, central bank says they want 0 inflation. Right? But let's say you're a member of the public in this model. Yesterday, the central bank said they wanted 0 inflation. They hit you with inflation of lambda times alpha, which was not 0 inflation. It's above 0. So the last time they said they were pursuing a policy consistent with 0 inflation, they didn't stick to their word. Why do you trust them to stick to their word now? Right? It's the boy who cried wolf. Right? Or really any compulsive liar in this case. Why would you believe somebody who's a compulsive liar? Because they've shown time and time again that they're a compulsive liar. There is no incentive to believe a compulsive liar, hence the boy that cried wolf. So the central bank says they want 0 inflation, the hope of which is to get the public to set expected inflation for tomorrow equal to 0. That's what they want. Because if the public can consistently keep expected inflation at 0, then they can consistently keep the rate of output above the natural rate of output. But the public's smart-ish under this case. They were dumb yesterday, but they're smarter today. they punish the Fed because they don't believe the Fed anymore, so they punish them by setting their expectations of inflation equal to lambda times alpha, because that's what happened last time, right? If we think about it in the context of past behavior predicting future behavior, the past behavior of the Fed suggests that inflation is going to be somewhere around lambda times alpha. So the public goes, well, all right, yeah, it's we don't really believe you on this one. So they don't. They set expected inflation to lambda times alpha. Now let's go ahead and update everything in this equation by one period. We got yt plus 1 equals yn, right? Yn does not change because yn is the natural rate of output. It's invariant over time, or at least over short periods of time. So it's not going to change between today and tomorrow. Alpha doesn't change. Alpha is considered to be constant. Why is alpha constant? Well, again, there's no t subscript on alpha. So anytime you see something without a subscript or a t subscript, it's assumed to be constant over time. Right? So alpha is constant over time. Inflation, on the other hand, is not. Inflation can vary from time to time. So what we got is this. Tomorrow's inflation minus the expectations of tomorrow's inflation, that whole thing multiplied by alpha, plus tomorrow's zero mean serially uncorrelated error term, which accounts for all non-monetary policy related shocks to the business cycle. This is what we get. Well, let's see. So again, the Fed, according to the Fed's utility function, conditional on the public's equation for output, they're still optimizing when inflation is set to lambda times alpha. But do we see the problem here now? They're optimizing when pi t star is set to lambda times alpha. So if you plug that in, call it plug and play. All right, well, yt plus 1 equals yn plus alpha times, this is where the plug and play comes in. Pi t plus 1, well, what's pi t plus 1? Well, if pi t star is equal to lambda alpha, and they're still optimizing tomorrow, pi t plus 1 star is still equal to lambda alpha, which is actual inflation. So actual inflation is pi t star, that's lambda alpha, minus, what's the expected inflation rate for tomorrow? Well, the expected inflation rate for tomorrow is given by this guy over here. E of pi t plus 1 is equal to lambda alpha. So what we get is alpha times lambda alpha minus lambda alpha plus the zero mean serially uncorrelated shock term for tomorrow. What does that give me? Well, it says, because the public got smart and updated their expectations, output tomorrow is equal to the natural rate plus any source of shocks. So the Fed can fool them for the first period, but they can't fool them in the second period. So under adaptive expectations, public gets fooled once, but not twice. They can get bamboozled once, however, they cannot be bamboozled again. That's under adaptive expectations. Now, you're like, okay, well, we at least boosted output for one period, right? That's good. We had an increase in output above the natural rate of output for the first period. The second period, it's just equal to the natural rate, except inflation's a little bit higher. Do we like that? Is that what's possibly considered socially optimal? Well, depends on a lot of things. However, more often than not, the answer to that is going to be no. Why? Higher inflation means economic inefficiency. What does that mean? Well, it means that the higher inflation we have, right, one, we're not going to have, once the expected inflation and inflation rates are equal, based on the public observing what the Fed has been doing, this term inside here zeroes out. However, we have higher inflation here, and higher inflation reduces utility for the Fed. Which leads us to conclude that if utility and output are high and inflation's low, then that's better than one period of high output followed by high inflation. Why? Because, well, higher inflation is going to reduce utility for the Fed, which is bad because, they do lose utility from increasing the inflation rate. And they've got no incentive to increase inflation beyond lambda times alpha, right? And so what we want, better to say instead of high, let's say this. If utility and output are average and inflation's low, it's better than one period of high output followed by multiple periods of high inflation. Why do we have multiple periods of high inflation afterwards? Well, if at any point the central bank wants to reduce the inflation rate below that of lambda times alpha, what we end up with is, if we look at this curve here, this will be less than this, making this entire thing negative. So positive times a negative is a negative. So it's going to reduce output below the natural rate of output. That's bad. The central bank doesn't want to do that. The central bank's got absolutely no incentive to reduce inflation below the expected rate of inflation. Now, as the public begins to see that the Fed is willing to ease off some of their inflationary policies, they may reduce their expected inflation rates. However, it's going to take a while. Now, there's another example, or another case of an expectational assumption that we want to talk about. So we talked about adaptive expectations. Under adaptive expectations, basically you're born dumb and you get smart along the way. Right? However, some people, I don't want to say in this situation are smarter than others, because they're definitely not, Right? I know a lot of gullible people that are very, very, very intelligent. They just happen to assume the best in everyone. By the way, for any World War II fans or World War II aviation fans, there is some incredibly sad news. A B-17 known as the 909 has crashed earlier this morning. I just got the news of it a few minutes ago. So far, 7 are confirmed dead. It's one of the last surviving airworthy B-17 planes that is in existence. This is the 909. This has just crashed in Hartford, Connecticut. It was also the first B-17 I ever flew in, and it was one of the first B-17s I ever set foot in. So, for those of you that don't care, well, okay. For those of you that do follow World War II aviation history stuff, very, very, very sad, tragic day. Anyways, the second expectations set we can talk about are what's known as rational expectations. Now, under rational expectations, under rational expectations, what happens is the public's already smart. They're already smart, and they're incredibly cynical people. They know, under rational expectations, the public knows the central bank's policy goals, and because they are aware of the central bank's policy goals, what they're going to do is they know, based on their policy goals, because they understand the objective function or this utility function for the central bank, they're aware of that, they're aware of this, they know the central bank is going to want some positive inflation rate. However, they're going to announce a zero inflation rate, or at least an inflation rate that is below that of what the actual inflation rate will be set at. Because they're aware of that, they know actual inflation is going to be pretty high. Therefore, they set their expectations to have high inflation. Therefore, what we get in the first period is this. We get the first period where output's equal to the natural rate plus shocks, right? And remember, on average, those shocks are zeros, so on average at any point in time, the natural rate is equal to the current rate of output. Tomorrow, it's the exact same thing. And so on and so forth. Every following period Under rational expectations, they already know that the Fed's going to set an inflation rate equal to lambda times alpha because they're aware of what the Fed's or the central bank's objective function or their utility function, whatever you want to call it, they're aware of what that is. They are aware that when the central bank maximizes their utility subject to the inflation rate, they will choose an inflation rate equal to lambda times alpha. So under rational expectations, there is absolutely no scenario whatsoever where everyone is optimizing and the central bank can increase output above the natural rate. It's a very, very, very important thing. So I'll say under rational expectations, under rational expectations, I'll give it 2 stars because that is super important. There exists absolutely no scenario whatsoever where the central bank can use policy to try to trick the public into increasing output above the natural rate at any point in time. Not just consistently, but at any point in time. And if they can't do that at any point in time, what's the point? So if the public has rational expectations, there's no point in trying to use inflationary policy to boost output above the natural rate. Why is that? Well, let's say the central bank decides to set the optimal inflation rate at something above lambda times alpha. Well, it'll increase output above the natural rate, at least for the first period, which is good, right? But remember, we've got 2 equations we're looking at here. We want both of them to be as high as possible. They set pi t star greater than lambda alpha. Fed utility falls too much. It falls more than output increases. So the central bank actually gets hurt by setting an inflation rate that's too high. Therefore, there is a limit to monetary expansion. That's the whole point of this model, is saying that there's a limit to monetary expansion, and it's entirely dependent, not entirely, but quite dependent upon the public's expectations of what the central bank is going to be doing regarding monetary policy decision making. Under rational expectations, the central bank can't trick the public because the public already knows what they're going to do. Under rational expectations, if we wanted to flip this to some of the examples I gave earlier on in this lecture, first example of rational expectations, right, which I believe was the thing with the siblings, right? One of your siblings says, if you do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to kill you. You go, no, you're not. Because you know they've got no incentive to do it. That's rational expectations. If you're dealing with a significant other who's interested or who has some vested interest in you not going out to go party without them, and they say, sure, go for it, go ahead, right? In the words of Admiral Akbar, it's a trap. It is a trap. It's a huge trap. And they do get trapped under adaptive expectations. But under rational expectations, they don't, because they go, you know what? I'm pretty smart now. Even though you said that, something tells me you don't really mean it. So I'm not going to go out. I'm not going to go out with my friends. I'm not going to go out and party. And consequentially, I'm not going to get my ass chewed. I'm not going to get in trouble under rational expectations, right? If you know you're out on the street, you get mugged by some guy, puts a gun in your face and says, give me your wallet or I shoot you, under adaptive expectations, you might give him your wallet. Under rational expectations, you're never giving him your wallet, so long as you know that in his objective function, he doesn't want to get caught, he doesn't want to be imprisoned, he does not want to be executed. So under rational expectations, you'll go, no, dude, screw you. Why am I going to give you my wallet? Or why would I give you my wallet? Because I know whether I give you my wallet or not, you're not going to shoot me. Because if you shoot me, you get caught, you go to jail. Like I said, depending on which state you're in, you get executed. You don't want that. So do you want 2 people to die? Or would you rather just give up on missing out with whatever's inside that wallet? However, you get to live. And even though you may not care about whether or not I live, at least should I be killed at some point in the future, it won't be at your hands. So you don't get in trouble for it. Rational expectations in that case would lead to what's known as like a more socially optimal outcome. So if we've got rational expectations, we know what everybody else is going to do. We know the Fed's going to set inflation above 0, even though they say, quote unquote, that they'll have a 0 inflation rate. Well, we both know that the Fed's not going to do that. And because the Fed doesn't do that under rational expectations, they adjust their expectation to be consistent with what the Fed actually ends up doing, and they cancel out any Fed policy. So this leads to the question of, is this good, bad, which is better, which expectational assumption's better, which one isn't? And that is what leads us to this discussion about rules versus discretion. Now, for thinking about rules versus discretion, the question becomes, well, first, what are rules? What's discretion in this case? If the central bank's allowed to exercise discretion, I need to erase this whole thing. Under rules versus discretion, which is a huge policy debate that is ongoing even to this day, not just within the central bank in the United States, which is known as the Federal Reserve Bank, but also with other central banks. There's a huge debate as to whether or not these banks should be bound by rules or should be given more discretion. Should they be given discretion, they can set policy as they please. Now, there are benefits to that, there are drawbacks to that. Additionally, if they're bound by rules, then they would be stuck with some sort of a rule with, zero inflation rate, or, Milton Friedman once suggested that the central bank could be bound by a rule of increasing the money base by like 2 or 3% every year. There was that idea. There was another rule where the nominal interest rate could be forced to be 0, in which case you would have basically a real interest rate equal to the rate of deflation in an economy. There are multiple policy prescriptions for both rules and discretion. The concept of each will be discussed in the next video. Thank you for watching this video, and in a couple of minutes I'll be posting another video on rules versus discretion. Thank you. Closing intro, that's super important that I don't have any idea or technology of my own to actually make, so just wacky waving inflatable hand waving tube man. Woo! We all know how that worked out last time.